Welcome to Mythos AI, your source for Cliff's Notes on complex subjects. Join Anna and Phil for yet another engaging conversation.
Okay, so let's dive into this idea of martial law in the U.S. Um, it's a term we hear a lot, like in movies or when there's a big crisis, but do we, really know what it means, in America?
You're absolutely right.
We've seen it in movies and TV shows where, the military, takes over and our freedoms get, suspended. Is that what martial law would actually be like here?
Not completely. You often see those dramatic images of troops on the streets, but martial law is really more about the legal side of things, like what gives them the power to do those things and, what it means for our democracy.
So it's not just the military being there, but, a change in, who's in charge and what the laws are.
Exactly.
One thing I found really surprising while researching this was that martial law isn't actually mentioned in the U.S. Constitution. How could something this important be, missing from our founding document?
That's a really interesting point, and I think it says a lot about what the framers were thinking. They were really worried about having too much power in one place, especially the military. They wanted to make sure that civilian leaders were always in control.
So they left out martial law on purpose.
That seems to be the most common understanding. But that doesn't mean they didn't think about times when, military force might be needed within the country.
So how did they plan for that without actually mentioning martial law?
They kind of scattered clues throughout the Constitution. For example, they made the president the commander-in-chief, which suggests he has a role in directing military action.
But wouldn't that be mainly for, wars in other countries?
Yeah, usually. But there are other parts of the Constitution that deal with using force within the U.S., like the Guarantee Clause. That one says the federal government has to protect states from being invaded.
So are you saying that those parts, even though they're about different things, could be used to justify martial law sometimes?
It really comes down to how you interpret the law. There's no easy answer. And that ambiguity is a big part of the debate about martial law in the U.S.
It sounds like it could lead to a lot of conflict and confusion, especially during a crisis.
Yeah, it definitely could. That's why it's really important to look at how martial law has actually been used in the U.S. throughout history.
So let's go back in time a bit. Can you give us some examples of how martial law has played out in America?
Sure, there have been quite a few instances, some more controversial than others, like back during the War of 1812, General Andrew Jackson declared martial law in New Orleans when the British were about to attack.
Yeah, Jackson was a strong personality. He was known for being decisive, but also for pushing the limits of his power. What exactly happened in New Orleans?
Well, he imposed curfews, limited people's movements, and even put a judge in jail for questioning his orders.
Wow, those are some drastic steps.
They were, but Jackson argued they were necessary to defend the city.
So the ends justify the means kind of thing.
You could put it that way. His actions ended up being challenged in court after the war, which really shows the tension between military necessity and the rule of law.
So even in the middle of a war, people tried to hold military leaders accountable when they overstepped their authority.
Exactly. Even in those early days, the American legal system was wrestling with the complicated nature of martial law.
The Civil War must have been full of martial law declarations, considering the huge threat to the nation.
You're right. It's considered the most widespread use of martial law in U.S. history. President Lincoln, facing a full-blown rebellion, took actions that basically amounted to martial law in certain areas, even if he didn't always use the term.
Lincoln suspended habeas corpus, right? Yeah. That's a pretty big deal.
It was. He said it was needed to prevent sabotage and keep order in important places. The most famous case was John Merriman, who was arrested in Maryland and held without trial.
So what happened to him?
Chief Justice Roger Taney, in a landmark ruling, said Merriman had to be released. He argued that only Congress could suspend habeas corpus. But Lincoln basically ignored the ruling. It shows the clash between the president and the courts during wartime.
So even in a crisis as bad as the Civil War, there were checks on the president's power, at least in theory.
Yeah, but those checks were often challenged and sometimes ignored in the name of national security. It's something we see again and again throughout American history.
Another important case from the Civil War is Ex parte Milligan. That one dealt with using military courts to try civilians.
That case set a really crucial precedent. The Supreme Court ruled that you can't use military courts to try civilians in places where civilian courts are still working.
So basically, the court recognized that martial law should be the very last option. used only when civilian authority has completely collapsed.
That's the main principle that came out of Milligan. It's a foundation of the legal framework surrounding martial law in the U.S.
Moving on from the Civil War, how did the use of martial law change in the 20th century?
The late 1800s and early 1900s saw a rise in states declaring martial law, often to deal with things like labor unrest, riots, and natural disasters. It became a tool for governors to stop social unrest and maintain control.
Can you give us an example?
Sure. During the Colorado labor wars in the early 1900s, the governor declared martial law in mining areas to stop violent strikes. They detained hundreds of miners without any formal charges, showing how martial law can be abused when it's in place.
So martial law went from a wartime thing to a way of managing domestic unrest.
Exactly. It became a way for those in power to assert control in situations where they felt threatened, even if those threats weren't as serious as a rebellion or invasion.
Yeah, it's easy to see how that could be a problem, especially if those in power use it to silence opposition or target certain groups.
That's right. That's why understanding the history of martial law is so important. It helps us see the potential dangers and why we need clear safeguards to prevent abuse.
The civil rights movement must have been a big test of these ideas, given all the social and political upheaval of that era.
It was. While not always officially declared, the ideas behind martial law were sometimes used, often in the form of states of emergency or National Guard deployments, to respond to protests and unrest.
One of the most famous examples is Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957. Governor Orville Faubus used the National Guard to stop the integration of Central High School.
That case showed how martial law could be used to block federal laws and undermine civil rights.
President Eisenhower eventually stepped in, put the Arkansas National Guard under federal control, and sent in federal troops to enforce integration.
That was a turning point that showed the limits of state power when it comes to defying federal law and constitutional rights.
Another significant event happened in 1962 when President Kennedy declared martial law in Oxford, Mississippi. This was to stop the violence surrounding James Meredith, an African-American student enrolling at the University of Mississippi.
Yeah, that was one of the few times a president officially used martial law in the 20th century. It shows how rare such a declaration is.
So throughout the 20th century, martial law was used in all sorts of situations, from labor disputes to natural disasters to civil rights protests.
Yes. And every time it happened, it showed the tension between needing order and security and protecting individual liberties.
It sounds like a really delicate balance, one that can easily tip in favor of those in power if there aren't clear protections in place.
That's exactly why understanding the history of martial law and the law surrounding it is so important. It helps us be more aware of the potential for abuse and why we need to be careful about defending our democratic values.
Let's move on to more recent times. Has there been any serious talk about martial law in the 21st century?
The idea of martial law has come up again in several situations, especially during times of crisis or when there's a lot of political tension.
For example, after Hurricane Katrina in 2005, there were a lot of rumors about martial law being imposed in New Orleans.
That's a common misunderstanding. The governor did declare a state of emergency and activated the National Guard, but they didn't suspend civilian law.
So it was more about using existing emergency powers, not a full-blown declaration of martial law.
Right.
Same thing after 9/11. Lots of talk about martial law, but it never actually happened.
Exactly. It seems like nowadays people try to avoid using the term martial law even when they're taking actions that look a lot like it.
Yeah, like they're aware of the negative image that comes with it.
Exactly. They know it could damage our democratic norms.
But there have been times when the possibility of martial law was openly discussed, even if it didn't end up happening.
You're right. One example was after the 2020 election, when some fringe figures suggested that President Trump could declare martial law to try to overturn the results.
Yeah, that idea was condemned by legal experts and even some people in Trump's own party.
It was seen as a dangerous and unconstitutional attempt to seize power.
Another time was during the 2020 George Floyd protests, when President Trump threatened to use the Insurrection Act.
That threat, even though it wasn't carried out, made people worry about the military being used to suppress dissent.
So, even though no one has officially declared martial law in the U.S. in the 21st century, it's been a real possibility in recent years, which shows how fragile our democratic norms are.
You're absolutely right. It reminds us that we can't take our freedoms for granted and that we need to be actively defending them.
Okay, so we focused a lot on the U.S. I'm curious, how do other democracies handle situations that are like martial law?
That's a great comparison. A lot of democracies have parts of their constitutions that
Yeah.
allow for states of emergency or similar things. They let the government have more power temporarily during crises.
But don't they usually have more specific safeguards to prevent abuse?
Yes, they do. They've learned from their own history and recognized the need to balance security needs with the protection of basic rights.
Can you give us some examples?
Sure. The Philippines, for instance, has a constitution that specifically talks about martial law. It's because of their experience with the Marcos dictatorship.
Marcos used martial law to take power and rule as a dictator for years. Right.
Yes, he did. Their current constitution has rules that limit how long martial law can last, require approval from Congress to extend it, and allow courts to review whether it was declared properly.
So they've put in checks and balances to prevent another dictator from taking over.
Exactly. Another example is France. They have a state of siege that gives the government more power during war or rebellion.
But their system also requires Parliament's approval to extend it beyond a short initial period, right?
That's right. It ensures that the president doesn't have unlimited power, even during emergencies.
Germany, with its history of Nazi rule, is obviously very sensitive to the potential for abuse of emergency powers.
Their constitution allows for states of emergency, but it strictly limits the use of the military for law enforcement inside the country and requires oversight from parliament.
So even a country that has experienced the horrors of authoritarianism, they recognize the need for emergency powers, but they've built in strong safeguards to prevent abuse.
Precisely. It's something other democracies can learn from.
Even the UK, which doesn't have a formal written constitution, has a framework for handling emergencies.
Their Civil Contingencies Act lets them declare a state of emergency, but any declaration has to be approved by Parliament.
So all these democracies see the need for extraordinary measures sometimes, but they've also taken steps to make sure those powers aren't abused and that they don't undermine democracy.
That's the key lesson. It's about finding the right balance between security and liberty and making sure emergency powers are used responsibly and transparently.
Now, I know we've spent a lot of time on history and legal frameworks. I'd like to shift gears and talk about something that could happen in the near future, a kind of hypothetical scenario.
Yeah, I think looking at a hypothetical situation can be really helpful. It helps us understand how these ideas could play out in the real world and what the consequences might be.
So let's imagine it's 2025. President Trump has just been inaugurated for a second term and is facing a crisis at the U.S.-Mexico border.
It's a scenario that people have been talking about and debating a lot, especially given President Trump's statements and policies on immigration.
What kind of crisis at the border could potentially lead to martial law being declared?
For such a drastic measure to be justified, the crisis would have to be seen as a huge threat to national security, something that overwhelms traditional law enforcement and requires a military response.
So we're not talking about a normal increase in border crossings or even a few isolated incidents of violence. It would have to be something much bigger and more destabilizing.
Exactly. It would require a combination of events that create a sense of immediate danger and chaos, something that could be portrayed as an invasion or insurrection.
Those are strong words that President Trump has used before when talking about the border.
Yes, he has. That's why it's important to think about the language that could be used to justify martial law. It's not just about the units themselves, but how they're presented to the public.
Can you give us some specific examples of what this hypothetical crisis might look like?
Imagine a massive surge of migrants all trying to cross the border at the same time, overwhelming Border Patrol agents and leading to violent clashes.
It sounds like total chaos.
It would be. And if those events were combined with, say, a terrorist attack linked to the border or a major attack by a drug cartel, people might quickly start thinking that national security is at risk.
So a mix of real events and maybe exaggerated threats could be used to make a case for martial law.
Exactly. The way a crisis is perceived can be just as important as what's actually happening, especially when it comes to justifying extreme measures.
Could intelligence reports play a role in this scenario?
Absolutely. Intelligence reports, whether they're accurate or not, could be used to make people afraid of an invasion or terrorists coming into the country through the border.
We've seen how intelligence reports can be manipulated or misinterpreted to start wars in the past.
Yeah, it's a pattern. And it's something we need to be aware of in this hypothetical situation.
Could what state and local authorities do also contribute to the justification for martial law?
Definitely. If state and local police are seen as unable or unwilling to maintain order, it could open the door for the federal government to intervene.
Like, imagine a border town being overrun by migrants, or a drug cartel launching a big attack on U.S. soil.
That would create a lot of panic, and people would demand a strong response.
And if the governor of that state declares a state of emergency but can't get the situation under control, it could give President Trump the excuse he needs to declare martial law.
Precisely. He could argue that the federal government has to step in and protect the country when states can't.
So this combination of events could lead to a situation where President Trump feels like he can take drastic action.
Yeah, it's something we need to consider seriously given the political climate and how these events could be used to justify an authoritarian power grab.
Okay, let's say this hypothetical crisis does happen,
Mhm.
and President Trump decides to declare martial law at the border. What legal tools could he use to try to justify this?
Well, there are a few legal avenues he could use, each with its own requirements and potential problems.
I'm guessing the most obvious one would be the Insurrection Act.
You're right. This law allows the president to send federal troops to enforce domestic law in specific situations, like stopping an insurrection or making sure laws are followed.
So President Trump could say that the situation at the border is an insurrection, or that the states aren't enforcing federal immigration laws.
That's probably what he would argue. He could claim that the huge number of migrants, maybe combined with violence and crime, has created a state of lawlessness that requires the military to step in.
Wouldn't that be a really broad interpretation of the Insurrection Act, though?
It would be, and it would definitely be challenged in court.
The Insurrection Act doesn't explicitly mention martial law, does it?
No, it doesn't. But once troops are deployed and start doing things that police usually do, like making arrests and enforcing curfews, it basically becomes martial law in practice.
This is more about what they're doing, not the exact words they use.
Exactly. To make it clear that it's martial law, President Trump could also issue a formal proclamation declaring a state of martial law in the border region, along with using the Insurrection Act.
That proclamation would be a pretty big escalation, wouldn't it?
Yes, it would. It would mean a clear shift in power and a suspension of normal legal processes.
Would using the Insurrection Act mean that President Trump would have unlimited power at the border?
Not necessarily. The Insurrection Act itself doesn't give unlimited authority. It's supposed to be used in very specific circumstances, and the courts could still review the president's actions.
So the courts could potentially step in and limit the scope of martial law or overturn specific things the military does.
They could, but it would be a complicated legal battle with uncertain outcomes.
Are there any other legal tools President Trump could use to try to justify martial law at the border?
He could try declaring a national emergency under the National Emergencies Act, specifically citing the border crisis.
Didn't he do something like that during his first term to get money for the border wall?
He did. In 2019, he declared a national emergency to move funds around for border wall construction. A lot of people criticized it, but the Supreme Court eventually upheld it.
But declaring a national emergency doesn't automatically authorize martial law or the deployment of troops for domestic law enforcement, right?
Correct. It's more about giving the president access to certain powers and signaling how serious the situation is.
So President Trump could use a national emergency declaration to strengthen his case for using the Insurrection Act or to justify other actions like sending the National Guard or redirecting resources to the border.
Yes, exactly. It would be part of a bigger legal strategy to make people believe there's a crisis that requires a military response.
Could he try to go around Congress completely and claim he has the inherent constitutional power to act?
It's possible, but very unlikely to work. He might try to argue that as commander-in-chief, he has the inherent power to repel invasions and that the border situation qualifies as an invasion, even if it's not a traditional military invasion by a foreign country.
He could try to say he's acting to protect the country from a threat that's right in front of us.
Right. He might even try to use the Constitution's guarantee clause, which says the federal government has to protect states from invasion. But those arguments would face a lot of legal challenges.
Why is that?
Because Congress has already passed laws about this, especially through the Insurrection Act. The courts would probably see the president as trying to avoid the process Congress has already set up for handling these situations.
So it would be a risky legal move.
Extremely risky. The courts probably wouldn't agree with such a broad interpretation of executive power, especially when Congress has already provided a more specific way to handle these types of crises.
What about the suspension clause? Could he try to suspend habeas corpus at the border?
That's another possibility, but one that's full of legal and constitutional controversy. The Constitution allows habeas corpus to be suspended in cases of rebellion or invasion when public safety demands it. However, it doesn't clearly say who gets to decide to suspend it. Historically, there's been debate about whether that power belongs to the president or to Congress.
Didn't Lincoln suspend habeas corpus during the Civil War?
He did, but he eventually asked for and received approval from Congress for what he did.
And what about Chief Justice Taney?
Taney, in his famous ruling on Ex parte Merriman, argued that only Congress has the power to suspend habeas corpus.
So it's a really complicated constitutional question with no easy answer.
Exactly. If President Trump tried to suspend habeas corpus at the border on his own without clear permission from Congress, it would almost certainly trigger immediate legal challenges.
Do you think the courts would uphold such a suspension?
Based on what happened in cases like Milligan, which said that constitutional rights can't be suspended in places where regular courts are still operating, the courts would be very skeptical. Unless they were willing to completely accept the president's claim of an invasion, which seems unlikely, they would probably say the suspension is unconstitutional.
So trying to suspend habeas corpus would be a big gamble for President Trump.
Absolutely. It would be a very risky legal move with potentially huge consequences for his presidency and for the rule of law.
Okay, so we've talked about the different legal ways President Trump could try to justify declaring martial law at the border. Let's say he goes ahead and does it. What would it actually look like? How would he make this decision public?
He probably wouldn't just come out and say, I'm imposing martial law. Instead, he'd probably issue a formal executive order and proclamation using legal language and designed to look official and necessary.
Can you give us an idea of what that kind of document might say?
Sure, it might go something like this. Whereas violent lawlessness and foreign cartel violence at the southern border of the United States have created a state of insurrection and invasion against the authority of the United States, and local authorities are unable to secure the border or protect American lives. Therefore, I, as President and Commander-in-Chief, hereby invoke the Insurrection Act and all other necessary legal authority to deploy the United States Armed Forces to the southern border region. I direct the Secretary of Defense to take all necessary measures to restore law and order. I hereby authorize military commanders in the border region to take temporary control of public security, enforce federal laws, and detain persons engaged in unlawful activity. I call upon all persons engaged in violence or illegal entry to disperse or face arrest. In the counties within 100 miles of the border in Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California, I am imposing a curfew from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. to be enforced by military and federal law enforcement personnel. Any persons detained as part of this operation who are believed to be members of transnational cartels or terrorist organizations will be held in military custody pending further decisions. This state of martial law shall remain in effect until the laws can be faithfully executed and public safety is assured.
Wow, that's a powerful statement. It seems to combine elements of the Insurrection Act with more traditional martial law language.
Exactly. He'd try to present it as both legal and absolutely necessary to deal with this crisis.
It would be a very controversial move, and I imagine the reactions from different groups would be quick and strong.
Oh, absolutely. Declaring martial law at the border would set off a chain reaction of responses from the military, state governments, Congress, and the courts, each with their own viewpoints and powers.
Okay, so let's break down those reactions a bit more, starting with the military. How do you think they would react to being told to do this?
The military's response would be really important. I mean, the president is their boss, the commander-in-chief, so if he gives a legal order, they have to follow it. But the question is, would military leaders see an order to deploy troops inside the U.S. and take on these martial law powers as legal?
That's a big difference, yeah. Just because they're told to do something doesn't mean they'll just do it without question.
Exactly. The Pentagon lawyers and the top generals would probably be involved in discussions before any declaration of martial law. If President Trump uses the Insurrection Act correctly, that would give him clear legal authority, and the military has a history of following such orders.
Like we saw in Little Rock in '57 and the LA riots in '92.
Right. However, if the orders go beyond what the Insurrection Act allows, things like telling the military to detain tons of civilians indefinitely or try them in military courts, those top military officials might have some serious reservations.
They'd know the legal limits from cases like Milligan.
Exactly. And if you look at recent history, you see that military leaders are sensitive to being used for partisan political purposes.
Like in 2020, General Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, was reportedly worried about the Insurrection Act being misused.
That's right. It's likely that military leaders in 2025 would also push back against orders they see as unlawful or politically motivated.
So there's a chance for some tension within the military on how to deal with this.
I think there's a good chance of that. But publicly, they'd probably follow orders and deploy units to the border.
What kind of units are we talking about?
You could see Army military police units, maybe parts of the Texas base, their 3rd Armored Corps, and possibly National Guard units from different states being sent to those border sectors.
How would they work with the civilian law enforcement agencies that are already there?
They'd need to coordinate really closely with Customs and Border Protection, ICE, and the other agencies involved in border security. The goal would be to set up a unified command structure so everyone is working together to manage the situation.
But wouldn't that probably create some friction? I mean, the military and civilian agencies have different cultures, different priorities, different ways of doing things. It wouldn't be easy to just blend them together.
No, it definitely wouldn't.
How would the military approach the use of force in this kind of scenario?
They'd likely come up with very clear rules of engagement to guide their actions. These rules would be designed to protect the troops while minimizing the use of lethal force against civilians.
That makes sense. The image of U.S. troops shooting at migrants would be a disaster from a public relations perspective.
Exactly. The focus would probably be on showing force, setting up checkpoints, and deterring illegal crossings.
What about detention? Would the military be responsible for detaining people?
It's possible they might set up detention facilities on military bases near the border to hold people who are arrested.
Could this lead to a situation where civilians are being held by the military for a long time without due process?
It's a real concern, yeah. It raises serious questions about whether people's civil liberties are protected under martial law.
And if habeas corpus is suspended, like we discussed earlier, those detainees would have even fewer legal options.
Right. It would create a really problematic situation where people could be held indefinitely without being able to challenge their detention in court.
Sounds like it could lead to a lot of abuse.
The potential is definitely there. It's one of the biggest risks that comes with martial law.
You mentioned President Trump could federalize the National Guard. What would that mean in practice?
If he federalizes the National Guard, those troops would then be under federal command. They'd answer to the president and the Secretary of Defense, not their state governors.
That would give the president even more direct control over the military at the border.
Exactly. And it would also take away the governor's ability to control how the National Guard is used in their states.
Wouldn't that cause some tension with those states, especially the ones that are against martial law?
I think it almost certainly would.
Let's talk more about those state-level reactions. How do you think the 4 border states, Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, and California, would respond to martial law being declared?
Their responses would probably depend a lot on their political leadership and how they feel about border security.
Okay, let's go through them one by one, starting with Texas. What do you think they would do?
Well, Governor Greg Abbott has often been on the same page as President Trump when it comes to border issues, and he's likely to still be governor in 2025. So it's probably safe to say that Texas would mostly be supportive of the federal government stepping in.
Abbott has already called the situation at the border an invasion, hasn't he?
He has, yes. And he's been pushing for stronger border security measures, things like sending the Texas National Guard and state police to the border.
So he'd probably welcome federal troops and cooperate with the martial law declaration.
That seems like the most likely outcome, yeah. He might even declare a state of insurrection or invasion in Texas before President Trump does anything, formally asking for federal help and giving President Trump more legal justification for his actions.
What about Arizona? How do you think their response would be different from Texas?
Arizona's a bit more complicated. Assuming that Katie Hobbs, the Democrat who was elected governor in 2022, is still in office, she might be less willing to accept martial law.
Hobbs has been more critical of President Trump's border policies, right?
Yes, she has. She's talked about the need for comprehensive immigration reform and treating migrants humanely.
So she might see martial law as the federal government overstepping its boundaries.
That's definitely possible. She could argue that Arizona can handle the situation using its own National Guard and state police, especially if they get more resources from the federal government.
But if President Trump declares martial law anyway, she'll be in a tough spot.
Yeah, for sure. She'll have to balance cooperating with the federal government to deal with a real security crisis, with her own concerns about people's rights and the potential for the federal government to go too far.
How do you think she would handle that?
She'd probably voice her concerns about the implications of martial law for people in Arizona, but still work with the federal government on practical matters.
So kind of a practical resistance.
And that's a good way to put it, yeah. She might refuse to officially ask for military help, even though the president doesn't technically need her request under some parts of the Insurrection Act.
And she could tell Arizona state agencies and the Arizona National Guard to keep operating under state control instead of taking orders from federal forces.
Right. That could lead to some friction and confusion on the ground, especially if there are disagreements over who's in charge or how much force is appropriate to use.
It's easy to imagine a situation where a sheriff in Arizona refuses to follow orders from an Army colonel.
Exactly. Those kinds of conflicts could escalate quickly and potentially lead to legal challenges or even standoffs between state and federal authorities.
So things could get pretty tense between Arizona and the federal government under martial law.
It's definitely possible. It would be a test of federalism and the balance of power between the states and the federal government.
Okay, what about New Mexico? How do you see them reacting?
Michelle Lujan Grisham, who's also a Democrat and has been critical of President Trump's border policies, is likely to still be governor in 2025. So I think it's reasonable to expect that New Mexico would side with Arizona in expressing doubts about martial law and emphasizing the importance of protecting civil liberties.
Their part of the border is shorter and sees less traffic than Texas or Arizona's,
Yeah.
but they would still be included in the martial law declaration.
Yes, that's right. And if anything happens in New Mexico that can be linked to the border crisis, President Trump would probably use it to justify including them in the martial law zone.
So even though New Mexico might not be as directly affected by what's happening at the border, they wouldn't escape the consequences of martial law.
Exactly. It shows how martial law in one area can affect a much wider region.
And how about California? What do you think Governor Newsom would do?
Well, if Newsom is still governor in 2025, his response is likely to be the strongest and most defiant among the border states. California has a history of pushing back against President Trump's policies, and they have a strong legal team that isn't afraid to challenge the federal government in court.
So they could cause a lot of trouble for the president.
There's a good chance of that.
Yeah.
California could file lawsuits right away, arguing that there's no insurrection or invasion in their state to justify martial law and trying to get a court order to block it from being enforced in California.
And they could make a strong argument that martial law violates the rights of Californians.
For sure. They can argue that curfews, checkpoints, and other limits on movement violate basic constitutional rights.
So California could become the main battleground for legal challenges to martial law.
It's definitely a possibility. They have the resources and the political will to put up a serious legal fight.
So we've got a potential for conflict between the federal government and some states, possibly within the National Guard itself, and between federal troops and local law enforcement. This is starting to sound like a real mess.
It definitely has the potential to become one. That's why martial law is seen as such a risky and extreme measure. It's not a simple solution, and it can often create more problems than it solves.
Now, let's shift our focus to Congress. What role do you think they'll play in this scenario?
Congress's response would depend a lot on the political climate at the time. Remember, we're assuming that President Trump has just started his second term, so he'll probably have a good number of loyal supporters in Congress, especially among Republicans.
And those supporters could make it hard for Congress to effectively limit the president's power.
Right. Let's say, for example, that Republicans have a slim majority in the House of Representatives, while Democrats have a slim majority in the Senate. That would create a divided Congress, making it even harder to agree on how to respond to martial law.
So what could Congress do, even if they're divided?
Well, one thing they could do is hold hearings to investigate, why martial law was declared and how it might affect people's rights. Like the Senate Judiciary Committee or maybe the Armed Services Committee could call administration officials to testify and explain what they're doing.
That would put some public pressure on the administration and show everyone the potential problems with martial law.
Yeah, it could. Another thing they could do is pass a resolution saying they condemn the declaration of martial law. It wouldn't actually do anything legally, but it would send a message that at least one part of Congress doesn't agree with what the president is doing.
But a resolution wouldn't actually have any legal power, right?
No, not really. It would be more about sending a political message and trying to get the public to oppose martial law.
Could Congress try to go further and pass a law to end martial law, or at least limit it?
They could try. For example, they could pass a law that says, Congress finds that the situation at the border doesn't qualify as a rebellion or invasion, and says that the president using the Insurrection Act for this purpose is wrong and needs to stop.
That would be a pretty direct challenge to the president's authority.
It would be. Or they could try something more specific, like limiting how long martial law can last, or saying that military courts can't be used to try civilians.
Those ideas might be easier for some members of Congress to swallow, the ones who aren't ready to completely overturn the president's decision.
Right. They could say it's about balancing security with protecting people's rights.
But to become law, any bill would need to pass both the House and the Senate and survive a presidential veto, right?
Yes, that's the hard part. And because there would probably be a lot of Trump loyalists in Congress, getting past those obstacles would be really difficult.
Let's imagine that Democrats, who are generally against martial law, managed to pass a bill in the Senate. Then it would go to the House, where Republicans have a slight majority.
And it would probably face a lot of opposition from the Republican leadership who wouldn't want to challenge the president on such a big issue.
So the bill could easily be stopped in the House or die in a conference committee.
That's a real possibility. And even if the bill somehow made it through both chambers, President Trump could just veto it.
And then it goes back to Congress for an override vote.
Exactly. And that's where the numbers matter the most. To override a presidential veto, they need a 2/3 majority in both the House and the Senate.
And considering how divided the parties are and how loyal many Republicans are to President Trump, it's highly unlikely that Democrats could get enough votes to override a veto.
I agree. It would take a lot of Republicans going against the president, which doesn't seem very likely in this situation.
So, realistically, Congress wouldn't be able to directly stop or limit martial law through passing laws.
That's the most likely scenario. They'd have too many procedural and political roadblocks.
But that doesn't mean Congress is completely powerless, does it?
No, definitely not. They still have other ways to influence things.
Like what?
Well, they could use their control over the money to try to change the president's actions.
How would that work?
Congress decides how the federal government spends money, so they could threaten to cut off funding for military operations related to martial law. For example, they could add amendments to important spending bills that say certain things can't be funded, like detaining civilians or having military courts.
They could put some real pressure on the president to back down on martial law, maybe even scale it back.
It could. It's one of the strongest tools Congress has to influence what the executive branch does.
But it's also risky, isn't it?
Oh, for sure. Threatening to take money away from the military during a time when people feel like national security is threatened could backfire. People might think they're undermining the troops or making the country weaker.
So Congress would need to weigh the possible benefits against the potential political fallout.
Exactly.
Are there any other ways Congress could try to pressure the president?
Individual members of Congress, especially those with a lot of influence or seniority, could try to talk the president into changing his mind. They could do this through private conversations or public statements.
They could appeal to his sense of duty or warn him about the long-term damage martial law could do to the country.
Right. It's impossible to know for sure how well that would work, but even President Trump has sometimes changed his mind because of personal appeals or political calculations.
So there's a chance that Congress could help moderate or even end martial law, even if they can't directly overturn it through legislation.
That's true. It just shows that political pressure and persuasion can sometimes be as effective as legal mechanisms.
And then there's always impeachment.
Yeah, that's always an option. If Congress believes President Trump has abused his power or gone against the Constitution, they could try to impeach him.
But impeaching a president is a very political process, and it's not likely to work unless both parties agree.
Right. Because of the partisan divide we've talked about, it's hard to imagine enough Republicans siding with Democrats to impeach and remove President Trump just because of how he's handling the border, especially if people see it as a national security issue.
So impeachment is a long shot, at least at the beginning of this scenario.
I think that's fair to say. It's a last resort, and it would probably only happen if President Trump did something seriously illegal or lost the support of his own party.
Let's talk about the courts. What role do you see them playing in this hypothetical martial law situation?
The courts would almost certainly be where people challenge the legality and scope of President Trump's martial law declaration.
Yeah, we've already discussed some of the legal arguments against martial law, like the limits set by the Milligan decision and the questionable constitutionality of suspending habeas corpus.
Right. Those arguments would probably be the main focus of any legal challenges.
Who do you think would be the main ones filing these lawsuits?
We'd probably see a lot of lawsuits from different groups, like states that oppose martial law, civil liberties organizations, and individuals whose rights have been violated by the military.
Well, let's talk about those groups a little more, starting with the states. Which ones would be most likely to sue?
California would almost certainly be one of the first to sue. They have a history of fighting President Trump's policies in court, and they're committed to protecting the rights of their residents.
And they have the resources and expertise to put up a real legal fight.
They do. New Mexico, led by Governor Lujan Grisham, might also join the lawsuit, and depending on what the federal government does, even Arizona under Governor Hobbs might think about suing.
So we could see a lawsuit with multiple states challenging the legality of martial law.
It's definitely possible. That would put even more pressure on the administration and make the legal battle even more important.
What about civil liberties organizations? What would they do?
Groups like the ACLU would almost certainly be involved. They have a long history of defending constitutional rights, and they know a lot about the legal issues around martial law.
So they could file lawsuits on behalf of people whose rights have been violated or challenge the martial law declaration itself based on broader constitutional arguments.
Exactly. They would be key players in the legal fight against martial law.
And then there are the individuals who are directly affected by martial law. What kind of legal claims could they make?
If people are detained by the military without access to a lawyer or a judge, they could file habeas corpus petitions in federal court.
We talked about the possibility of President Trump suspending habeas corpus.
Yeah.
Would those petitions still be valid if that happens?
That's a tricky legal question. The government would probably argue that the courts can't hear habeas corpus petitions if the writ has been suspended.
But wouldn't that basically mean the executive branch can detain people without any oversight from the courts?
That's the danger. It's why suspending habeas corpus is so controversial.
It's a fundamental right that protects people from being detained for no reason.
Exactly. If the courts let the president suspend habeas corpus without any real review, it would set a dangerous precedent.
So it's likely that any suspension of habeas corpus would itself be challenged in court.
Absolutely. It would be one of the most hotly debated issues in this situation.
What other legal claims could people make?
If they're subjected to curfews or checkpoints that stop them from moving around freely, they could sue, arguing that their freedom of movement and other constitutional rights are being unfairly restricted.
And what about the use of military courts to try civilians?
That would also be a huge point of contention. Like we discussed, the Milligan decision says that civilians can't be tried in military courts if civilian courts are still working.
So any attempts to use military courts to try civilians would likely be challenged in court.
Definitely. It would be a clear violation of established law.
So we could see a wave of lawsuits challenging different parts of the martial law declaration, from the initial deployment of troops to the specific actions taken by the military.
That's a real possibility. The courts would be flooded with cases.
How do you think the courts would handle all these cases?
That's hard to say because it would depend on the specifics of each case and who's on the courts.
The Supreme Court in 2025 will probably have a 6-3 conservative majority, right?
That's likely, based on what we're seeing now.
So how do you think the conservative justices would rule on these martial law cases?
It's hard to predict for sure. Conservative justices tend to give more leeway to the president, especially when it comes to national security.
So they might be more likely to uphold the president's actions, at least to some degree.
It's possible, but even conservative justices are bound by legal precedent and the Constitution.
Like the Milligan decision, for example, which sets clear limits on the use of martial law.
Right, so even if they agree with the president's goals, they can't just ignore established law?
So the Supreme Court might say it's okay to send troops, but overturn more extreme measures, like suspending habeas corpus or using military tribunals.
That's definitely a plausible outcome.
Yeah.
They might try to find a middle ground between security concerns and protecting individual rights.
It would be an interesting legal battle to watch unfold.
It would be. The Supreme Court's decisions on these martial law cases would have a big impact on the future of American democracy.
What about the lower courts? How do you think they would handle these cases?
The lower courts, especially district courts in the border region, would be right on the front lines of this legal fight. They would be the first to hear challenges to the martial law declaration and decide on requests for injunctions or other legal relief.
They might be more willing to rule against the government, especially if they see clear violations of constitutional rights.
That's definitely possible. They might be less likely to just go along with the executive branch, especially since they'd be dealing with the immediate effects of martial law in their communities.
So we could see the lower courts being more protective of individual rights than the Supreme Court.
It's happened before. Lower courts are sometimes more willing to push back against the government, knowing that their decisions can be appealed to higher courts.
So it would be a complicated and unpredictable legal situation, with different courts weighing in on different parts of the martial law declaration.
You got it. It would be a test of how independent the judiciary is and whether they can uphold the rule of law when the executive branch is overreaching.
Let's talk about the timeline of these legal challenges. How long would it take for these cases to make their way through the courts?
Lawsuits can take a while, especially when dealing with complicated constitutional questions.
So the courts probably wouldn't be able to resolve these challenges right away.
Probably not. It could take months or even years for these cases to be finally decided, especially if they go all the way up to the Supreme Court.
So martial law could stay in place even while it's being challenged in court.
That's a real possibility. It shows how the judicial system can't always keep up with quickly developing crises.
It also makes you wonder if lasting damage could be done while these legal battles are going on.
You're right. The longer martial law is in effect, the more it could erode democratic norms and make people lose trust in the government.
So even if the courts eventually rule against martial law, the damage might already be done.
That's a risk we have to consider.
That's a scary thought. It shows how important it is to prevent martial law from being declared in the first place, or at least make sure it ends as soon as possible.
I agree. The best way to protect our democracy from the dangers of martial law is to prevent it from becoming normal or accepted as a routine way to deal with crises.
That's a really important point. We need to be proactive in defending our rights and holding our leaders accountable to make sure martial law is truly a last resort, used only in the most extreme situations.
Couldn't agree more. It's a responsibility we all have as citizens in a democracy.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive into the complexities of martial law, the big takeaway is this. It's a concept with a long and often troubling history, something that should be avoided whenever possible, and if it has to happen, it needs to be done with extreme caution and a quick return to normal as the goal.
I agree. The best way to deal with martial law is to prevent it from happening in the first place. And that means making our democratic institutions stronger, encouraging people to get involved in their communities, and upholding the rule of law.
It's a responsibility we all share. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's given you a better understanding of martial law and how it could impact American democracy.
Thanks for having me.
And to you, our listeners, stay informed, stay involved, and stay vigilant. Our democracy depends on it.
Thanks for listening to Mythos AI. Stay tuned for more concise insights. And remember to hit the like button and subscribe for future episodes.